Welcome to PIHU classes. Today we will learn renin-angiotensin and aldosterone system.
The main job of the cardiovascular system is to keep the blood moving, and to help facilitate that, blood pressure is kept under tight control. A major way that the body does this is through a set of hormones that make up the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. But first things first, everything starts in the kidney. Blood from the renal artery flows into smaller and smaller arteries, eventually reaching the tiniest of arterioles called the afferent arterioles. After the afferent arteriole, blood moves into a tiny capillary bed called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is part of the functional unit of the kidney called the nephron. There's about 1 million nephrons in each kidney, and each of them consists of a renal corpuscle, made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule surrounding it, and a renal tubule. Interestingly, once the blood leaves the glomerulus, it doesn't enter the venules. Instead, the glomerulus funnels the blood into the efferent arterioles, which divide into capillaries a second time. These capillaries are called peritubular capillaries because they're arranged around the renal tubule. This filtrate then enters the renal tubule. The renal tubule is made up of a proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, also known by the more fancy name of the loop of Henle, which has an ascending limb and a descending limb, and then finally the distal convoluted tubule. As filtrate makes its way through the renal tubule, waste and molecules such as ions and water are exchanged between the tubule and the peritubular capillaries until blood is filtered of any excess. Then finally, the peritubular capillaries reunite to form larger and larger venous vessels. The veins follow the path of the arteries, but in reverse. So they keep uniting until finally they form the large renal vein, and that then exits the kidney and drains into the inferior vena cava. Okay, now if we zoom into the wall of the afferent arterioles, we'll find a very special kind of smooth muscle cell called juxtaglomerular cells, because they're next to, or juxta, the glomerulus. The main job of these cells is to always keep a beady eye open for signals that the blood pressure needs to rise. These signals can come in 3 ways. Firstly, juxtaglomerular cells are mechanoreceptors, and they're designed to mechanically feel low blood pressure in the incoming blood. Secondly, glomerular cells are supplied by sympathetic nerve fibres. Sympathetic nerves start firing when there's something stressful going on, like chasing someone who stole your sandwich. Sympathetic nerves help boost how hard and fast your heart beats, which increases cardiac output. And it also causes contraction of smooth muscle cells around the arterioles, which causes vasoconstriction throughout the body, as well as in the juxtaglomerular cells. This boosts blood pressure in stressful situations. The third signal for juxtaglomerular cells comes from the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, where we can find specialized cells called macular densa cells. Macular densa cells are chemoreceptors that can sense when glomerular filtration rate increases based on the quantity of sodium and chloride ions flowing through the tubule. So here's how it works. When blood pressure rises, renal blood flow and, as a consequence, glomerular filtration rate also increase. This means that there's more fluid and more dissolved sodium and chloride ions that reach the macula densa. In response to the increased fluid and sodium and chloride ions, macular densa cells release adenosine, which diffuses over to the nearby juxtaglomerular cells in the efferent arteriole to tell them that something's gone wrong. So all 3 types of signals stimulate the juxtaglomerular cells to secrete renin. Renin is an enzyme that gets into the plasma and looks for its primary substrate, angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is a large protein made up of over 400 amino acids, and it's produced by the liver, and it's always hanging out in the blood. Now when they meet up, renin cleaves off a huge chunk of the angiotensinogen protein, leaving behind a tiny fragment called angiotensin 1. That's just about 10 amino acids long. It's a bit like a tiny pearl found within a giant oyster, you might say. Angiotensin 1 floats through the blood until it reaches various capillaries in the body. Endothelial cells in general, but mostly those lining the vessels in the lungs, have an enzyme on their surface called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE for short, which converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin-converting enzyme basically grabs angiotensin 1 and chops off 2 of its amino acids, leaving behind an 8 amino acid chain, which is a really powerful hormone called angiotensin 2. Angio means blood vessel, and tensin means making everything more tense. Like tensing your bicep. So angiotensin 2 goes to the smooth muscles lining the arterioles all over the body and causes them to tense up or contract, which leads to vasoconstriction of those blood vessels, and this increases resistance to blood flow. Angiotensin 2 then embarks on a journey through the blood, and when it reaches the kidneys, it binds to angiotensin receptors along the afferent and efferent arterioles. Just like adrenaline, it causes those arterioles to constrict, and, as before, the increased arteriole resistance leads to a low renal blood flow. However, there's a mechanism to ensure that even though less blood gets to the kidneys, glomerular filtration rate is maintained at a constant level. But how is that possible? Well, I'll tell you. The reason that is possible is that the efferent arterioles are much more responsive to angiotensin 2 than the afferent arterioles. So, when there are low levels of angiotensin 2, only the efferent arterioles constrict, and this means that less blood leaves the glomerulus, or, said differently, it makes more blood remain in the glomerulus, thereby preserving the glomerular filtration rate. However, when there are high levels of angiotensin 2, both the afferent and efferent arterioles constrict, and this decreases both renal blood flow and glomerular filtration rate. Angiotensin 2 also acts on the cells that line the proximal convoluted tubule, making them reabsorb more sodium ions from the filtrate. And then by the process of osmosis, water begins to follow the sodium ions, because where the sodium goes, the water flows. Angiotensin 2 also acts on the hypothalamus, which is at the base of the brain, where it stimulates thirst and increases production of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. ADH has its main effect on the cells lining the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, where it stimulates more aquaporins to get into the luminal surface of the cells. Aquaporins make these cells more permeable to water, which increases water reabsorption. Ultimately, the increased thirst and water reabsorption increases the total circulating blood volume, or blood flow, symbolised as Q. In addition, the increased peripheral arterial resistance increases the total body resistance, symbolised as R. Change in blood pressure is symbolised as P. And since the change in blood pressure P equals blood flow, Q, times resistance, R, and both the blood flow and resistance are increasing, it makes sense that the blood pressure rises. But angiotensin 2 is a busy little thing, and its work doesn't end there. It also helps to stimulate the adrenal glands, which are a pair of glands that sit on the top of each kidney. When we slice open an adrenal gland and zoom in, we can see that it's made up of 2 parts, an inner medulla and an outer cortex. The cortex can be further subdivided into 3 more layers: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the cells in the outermost layer, the zona glomerulosa, causing them to secrete the final player in our system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is aldosterone, obviously. Aldosterone belongs to a class of steroids, or lipid-soluble hormones, called mineralocorticoids, which help to regulate the sodium concentration in the body. Aldosterone does that by acting on the cells that line the distal tubules and the collecting ducts. Aldosterone gets into the cells and binds its receptor, forming an aldosterone receptor complex. This complex is able to control the expression of genes, increasing the levels of some proteins over others. One protein that gets expressed a lot is the sodium-potassium ion pump, which sits on the basal surface of the cells. These pumps push sodium into the blood and pull potassium into the cells. Ultimately, this helps to drive a concentration gradient that pulls sodium and water out of the lumen of the tubule and into the blood. And as before, this helps to boost blood pressure. Keep in mind, though, that this process can take several hours or even days, so it's considered a late response of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay, so now I'm going to take all of this information and condense it into one tiny super diagram. Right, so whenever there's a decrease in blood pressure, kidneys secrete renin, and that converts angiotensinogen, which is made by the liver, to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin converting enzyme, made mainly in the lungs, converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 causes the efferent arteriole to constrict more than the afferent arteriole, which increases the glomerular filtration rate. It also causes the proximal tubule to reabsorb more sodium, which increases thirst and helps increase blood pressure. And finally, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which gets the kidneys to retain sodium and water, also helping to increase blood pressure.
Thank you.